Well, let's speak to journalist and Middle East expert Nabila Ramdani and to Khalid, whose uncle and grandfather were both killed by Gaddafi. Khalid, and this must be enormously exciting for you and for your family to look at this, but do you have concerns as well?
Of course we have concerns. First and foremost, what is going to happen over the next couple of days? How strong is the pro-Gaddafi support in Tripoli still? And what are they prepared to do? In the long term, obviously, a transition of this level and magnitude is going to be very complicated and take some time, which we are worried about. A few things, such as the Islamic extremists, which isn't a big problem, but something still to be considered. We have to think about the tribal side of things, which I heard you speaking about with your last person, which, to be honest, I kind of agree with her to a certain extent on the tribal side. Not the whole of Tripoli is not tribal, especially in Tripoli. There's a very strong family base there. And it's been a very, very long time, mostly due to Gaddafi being in power for 40 years, since the tribes have really had any say in the grand scale of how things work in Libya and Libya as a whole. So what they'll be expecting and what kind of part they're going to have to play in the future is still to be seen.
Right.
And hopefully it won't be too complicated.
Right. Nabila, it is remarkable what's happened in the last 24 hours. There seems to have been really very little resistance from Gaddafi's forces, despite his rallying call to them to come out and fight for their country. Does it seem to you as though the regime is crumbling around him?
Well, it was indeed quite extraordinary that there was an awful lot of twists and turns yesterday. A few hours ago only, everybody was fearing a bloodbath in Tripoli and a bitter fight between rebel forces and Gaddafi loyalists because precisely of the defiant attitude put on by the Gaddafi regime. And I'm afraid to say, there's still bitter fighting going on in Tripoli itself. There are, not only isolated snipers, but also pockets of resistance and nasty fighting, which is escalating. And rebel forces are moving from the east of the country towards Tripoli, armed to try to not only they've entered Tripoli now, they haven't won Tripoli yet, but I think the biggest challenge will be to hold down a city like Tripoli, which, let's not forget, is the stronghold of the Gaddafi regime, and it's a city which has been under the control of Gaddafi for 42 years and has indeed been shaped by Gaddafi. So the biggest challenge will be to hold down a city like that.
What about the support for the rebels and how they move on from here? We were hearing this morning, for instance, that there were 46 NATO strikes yesterday to strengthen their arm, to speed them, if you like, towards Tripoli. Are you confident, Nabila, that they've got what it takes to run this country now after, as Khalid said, over 40 years of Gaddafi being in charge and smothering all opposition?
Well, there is no doubt, as you said, that the only reason why the rebels were allowed to get so close to Tripoli and eventually enter Tripoli is because of NATO air cover and indeed air power. So that's a very important aspect in all this conflict. And as to the rebels' ability to, I think one of the immediate concerns is the management of security and policing, and indeed the establishment of law and order. That is going to prove very challenging indeed. And I'm afraid to say that both your guests have underplayed the rivalries, the entrenched tribal rivalries and regional rivalries, and to ignore that, it's simply to ignore the history of Libya, and especially when you go through a conflict, a bitter conflict like this one, you get a build-up of grievances, a desire for revenge, and a build-up of rivalries, even on the side of the people fighting Gaddafi. You already have various factions claiming, control over resources, and also some rebel forces are saying that they've done most of the fighting and hence they deserve to be in charge. So there seems to be also a discrepancy between the leadership of the National Transitional Council and the rebels on the ground. and that's going to prove the biggest challenge for the rebel forces and the TNC to put the house in order in the aftermath.
Khalid, that is a worry, isn't it? I mean, the rebels are talking already about elections, but you look at the other countries that went this way during the so-called Arab Spring. Many of them are still floundering, really, trying to deal with a new dispensation, which is so very different to the way that they'd lived previously.
I agree. I think that there's certain things with Libya that may benefit, in fact, over places like Egypt. The fact there isn't a strong military group that's going to stay in power or still be around once Gaddafi has left, whereas in Egypt the army took over and therefore had a lot of control. In Libya, we're going to literally be starting from zero, from nothing. Gaddafi has stopped all political opposition over the 40 years, as you just mentioned, so there really is nothing there to sort of directly stand in its place except for the NTC. Now, the NTC have actually officially stated that none of their members will be allowed to run for government in the future, which shows that they're already showing a willingness to play their part right now, but in the future to step back and let the people decide where the country will go. So I think it's going to be very complicated. It's going to be very tricky. The tribal thing, I didn't mean to underplay it. It's certainly going to be a big issue, but one which I believe is not going to be as big. It's not like Libya has always been this tribal country where there's been 5 tribes and everything has been run between them. For a long time, even before Gaddafi's times and the Senussi times and even prior to that, it wasn't purely tribal country. So yes, the tribal side is going to be a big a big problem, but I don't think it's not all about the tribes.
Nabila, what about the oil? I have a texter, Simon, who says the overthrow of Gaddafi will mean the installation of a puppet regime and cheap oil for NATO countries and America. He's asking why no intervention in Syria. There's no oil there. It is crucial, isn't it, the oil and what happens to it and how, I suppose, the wealth that it creates is now used in Libya.
Well, absolutely, and it's no coincidence that during the conflict there was already talks between the National Transitional Council and foreign oil companies like Shell and Total going on. So, I'm afraid to say this conflict in Libya has an awful lot to do with oil and natural gas and the prospect of Western countries to get hold or benefit from those revenues. There's also in Libya, we're seeing different factions vying for oil revenues, and one of sort of grievance coming from the east already is that the oil revenues from Benghazi were used in Tripoli. But people in the West who didn't like Gaddafi might not be very happy if the result of the fall of the Gaddafi regime is that the oil revenues are redirected towards the East. So that's going to prove crucial as well, not only vying for oil revenues within the country itself, but also with NATO members who got involved in the liberation of the country.
Thanks both of you very much.